good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, everyone, wherever you're joining from. Welcome to the webinar, Nuclear Risk Reduction and Disarmament. Is it time for no first use policies in the USA and globally? The webinar today will last approximately 2 hours, and we will leave some time at the end for questions and or comments. Please leave your questions in the Q&A box and I will read them out to speakers at the end. The session today will be moderated by Mr. Marc Finot, who is Head of Arms Proliferation at the GCSP. Mr. Finot, I will leave it to you.
Thank you very much, Aurélie, and welcome to all of you who are joining us. We'll just let you join in and take the time of getting ready for this webinar. We are very grateful, actually, for all of you to have registered. There will be almost 500 registrations, which is the upper limit of our Zoom webinar. This shows the great deal of interest and timeliness of this discussion at a time when, of course, we have a new administration in Washington, but also ongoing tensions between the United States and Russia and NATO and other flashpoints around the world where the risk of nuclear war has, according to many experts, increased in the past years. So this is very timely that we discuss nuclear risk reduction as a general emergency or urgent measure. Of course, this is not incompatible with all the other aspects of this discussion of arms control, non-proliferation and actual disarmament, elimination of nuclear weapons. But for many experts around the world, this urgency of nuclear risk reduction includes the possibility of moving towards the doctrine of non-first use. As you know, at the moment, only 2 nuclear armed states apply this doctrine, China and India. The Soviet Union has applied it, has proclaimed it during the Cold War from 1982 to 1993, but it has been discontinued by the Russian Federation. Now, as we know, there are discussions within the United States about a possible new nuclear posture review and evolution of the United States doctrine closer to this doctrine of non-first use or sole purpose, as it's sometimes called. And obviously, if this is the case, and we'll hear more from our American speakers, what they think, this will have major consequences, of course, on relations between the United States and Russia, but also with the other nuclear armed states. And so therefore, it's as I said, it couldn't be more timely to have this discussion now. We are very pleased to have such a high-level panel of experts. We call on experts from the United States and Europe because this webinar is targeting these 2 regions for time zones reasons that you understand. This morning, early in European time, there was another similar webinar organized with the same partners, focusing on Asia and the Pacific. It was, of course, very interesting to hear the overall interest also from people from that region on possible evolution of doctrines towards non-first use. Let me recall that this event is organized by the GCSP, but co-sponsored by several other organizations: Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, PNND, Peace Depot Japan, People for Nuclear Disarmament, Prague Vision Institute for Sustainable Security, and World Future Council. So without further ado, we'll ask the speakers to speak about 10 minutes each. And at the end of this panel, we will start the questions and answers session. As already said, please don't wait until the last minute to write your questions in the Q&A. The chat is not for asking questions, is maybe for specific messages, but please use the Q&A function to ask your questions. We will start with Thomas Countryman, who is the chair of the Arms Control Association Board of Directors and former United States Assistant Secretary of State for International Security and Non-Proliferation. Tom, you've been, of course, involved under the Obama administration in these discussions about the nuclear posture review, which was almost ready to move towards non-first use. It was decided not to do so, but perhaps you can give us some background and speak about your expectations from the Biden administration. Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark, for bringing together these speakers and such a large audience. I want to say I'm especially honored to share a screen with Lord Hannay, from whom, while he was British ambassador to the United Nations Security Council, I learned a great deal about effective diplomacy. Military experts will tell you that declarations are interesting, but what matters is capabilities. That a declaration of no first use is only meaningful if it is reflected in the nuclear arsenal of a potential adversary, that capabilities matter more than good intentions. I have to take issue with that, and the message that I think the Biden administration is hearing, and that I hope friends in Europe are hearing, is that words matter. Rhetoric matters. For a long period after the end of the Cold War, and even before then, the major nuclear powers stopped talking about nuclear weapons as what made them great powers. Rather, they focused on other issues, and it was primarily North Korea and occasionally Pakistan who boasted about nuclear arsenals. That changed first with President Putin, and then with President Xi, and then with President Trump in the way that they spoke about nuclear weapons. More importantly, there's a steady drop in the role of nuclear weapons in official US doctrine from the 1950s all the way up to 2016, that the US constantly narrowed the range of conditions under which it might consider use of nuclear weapon, at the same time that it steadily dropped the size of its arsenal and the diversity of its arsenal. This trend was reversed slightly, but very significantly with the Trump nuclear posture review in 2018, which spelled out more explicitly contingencies of non-nuclear attack to which the United States could respond with nuclear weapons. And today, I think that President Biden, as a person who has studied these issues longer than any other new president that the United States has ever had, is quite aware that his words and his leadership have the potential to change the direction and reduce the risk of nuclear use. The president was very clear when, as vice president, he said in January 2017 that he and President Obama were convinced that the sole purpose of nuclear weapons should be to deter nuclear use by other countries. Whether he will say this again, prior to initiation of a new nuclear posture review by the administration is still uncertain. The reasons that he may do it are, first, that I believe that he believes it. He articulated the position, the argument in favor of no first use within the Obama administration's discussions in 2016. He said it publicly using the term sole purpose rather than no first use in his final month as vice president. He said it on the campaign trail, and it's in the Democratic Party platform. And finally, in his interim national security strategy, he said that the US will reduce the role of nuclear weapons in its defense strategy. At the same time, there are reasons that this may not happen as rapidly as many of us would hope. If you listened or read about his speech to the Congress last night, he has a very long list of domestic priorities involving huge expenditures on which he wishes to see action from a closely divided Congress. And he may not wish to put out all the most controversial changes in policy at the very beginning of his term. Secondly, I think he realizes, and certainly his advisors realize, that this is an issue that concerns America's allies in both Europe and Asia. And therefore, there's a need to consult with allies. The leitmotif of the Biden foreign policy so far has been to rebuild alliances so severely undermined by the last president. And he has said more explicitly than I've ever heard from an American president before that he wants to listen to allies. That's an original thought. And so there may be a period of time in which he is not only rebuilding alliances, particularly with NATO, but also consulting with allies. And there's also a need for him to give guidance in the near future to a new nuclear posture review. And clearly, the bureaucrats charged in the Departments of Defense and State and Energy with writing that review could use more guidance than simply a statement that we want to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in defense strategy. Now, whether the president ends up articulating no first use, as he advocated within the administration in 2016, or the closely related but not identical concept of sole purpose, as he stated in January 2017 and during his campaign, or another option that is out there now as proposed by some thinkers, an existential threat policy, one that says the US would only consider use of nuclear weapons if it were the only means available to stop an existential attack upon the US or upon allies. I can't predict at the moment which way the president will go and how soon he would make such a declaration. But I remain convinced that it will have several advantages for US national security and for global security. First, it will reduce the risk of nuclear war, whether it starts by accident, false alarm, or by escalation from a conventional conflict in Europe or elsewhere. Secondly, I think it would do a lot to restore the lost leadership of the United States in the entire field of non-proliferation and arms control. And this matters as we come up to the review conference of the Non-Proliferation Treaty in August. And third, I think it provides genuine impetus for the strategic stability dialogue that the US hopes to initiate with Russia this year. I have reason to hope that it will begin as soon as this summer and would lay a different set of assumptions for what will be the most complex, but also the most significant negotiations that Moscow and Washington have ever had. Just a couple of words about it, what it means for our friends in Europe. who are listening today. First, this is not the Cold War anymore. During the Cold War, Warsaw Pact conventional superiority meant that European security rested upon the readiness of the US to employ nuclear weapons in the face of a conventional attack from the Warsaw Pact. The situation is now reversed. The NATO Pact has conventional superiority over the Russian Federation, and it is one of the reasons that Moscow is reluctant to enunciate a policy of no first use. What Europe needs to recognize is that first use is not likely to be an all-out strategic attack by the US or Russia against the other. The most likely scenario for first use of nuclear weapons is the escalation from some form of accident, incident, conflict on the European continent. And the first use of nuclear weapons would be on European territory. Therefore, I conclude that it is manifestly in Europe's interest not only to sustain and build a conventional defense that is not threatening to Russia, but is fully deterring to Russia, and at the same time to support and not to question any move that President Biden might make in the direction of a more restrained declaratory policy. Thanks very much, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you very much, Tom. I think you raised all the key questions. First, the importance of rhetoric, declarations. Everybody remembers the Reagan-Gorbachev statement that nuclear war cannot be won, therefore should not be fought. But also, of course, the relationship with force structure of procurement of various categories of weapons. As we know, in the past few years, we've seen introduction of new categories of weapons which lower the threshold of use. So therefore, this is clearly connected. Of course, you mentioned domestic challenges, which everybody is aware of and which happen everywhere. The role, of course, of extended deterrence and relationship with the allies, which is, of course, a key issue because as we know, we understand that under the Obama administration, there was reluctance to move towards non-first use from some of the allies. And therefore, there's a need to convince them or to find substitutes for the current strategy. Of course, as you said, dialogue with Russia is crucial. And finally, the link with conventional weapons, which sometimes we tend to forget because nuclear war can most likely happen as a result of conventional conflict or crisis or escalation. So therefore, it's just impossible to separate those two. There is a natural continuum that should be part of the strategic dialogue. Now we move to the perspective from Russia, and we're pleased to welcome Andrei Baklisky. He's a Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Advanced American Studies, Institute of International Studies of the University of the Russian Foreign Minister MGIMO in Moscow. And I'm not, of course, expecting any answer point by point to what Thomas said, but I'm sure there will be a very interesting points that you can raise on the Russian side. Andrei, over to you.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks for having me in this important discussion. I would slightly disagree with Tom at some points, but overall, yeah, a lot of points he made make total sense. On Reagan-Gorbachev statement, I fully agree. I hope it will be reaffirmed. We probably will have a summit between our presidents sometime later this year. So either in bilateral format or in multilateral format in the P5, we hope there'll be reaffirmation of the fact that nuclear war cannot be won, should not be fought before 2021 NPT review conference. On the no first use, I think the number of issues should be concerned as a broader point. As you correctly noticed, USSR and Russia had no first use policy from 1982 to 1993, but not for a second did anyone in the West believed that there was no such option for Soviet Union, and NATO plans, United States plans were based mostly on capabilities, not on the statement, which was seen as a propaganda. And again, a lot of times when you speak to the Western analysts, they would say that they don't buy Chinese no first use pledge because there is a number of scenarios under which China might still use its nuclear weapons first. So there still should be some connection between what you say. I agree that words are important, but broader consistency between your statements, your messaging, your force posture, your force structure increases the level of how the people perceive your statements and how they perceive your possible future actions. Generally, nuclear deterrence, the clearer you state what you're trying to deter, the more sense this will bring to you. Under the current Russian military doctrine, the decision to use nuclear weapons is the sole prerogative of the president, but there are two broader conditions under which Russian leadership will consider its use. First is if Russia or its allies are attacked with nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction. The second is if Russia is attacked with conventional forces when the very existence of the state is under threat. So even if we take the first part, be it for Russia, be it for other nuclear weapon states, the question of chemical and biological weapons remain. Neither chemical nor biological weapons are very widespread, but they still exist, and deterring countries from attempting to use them or even thinking about using them without having your own chemical and biological weapons could be a legitimate goal. And when we talk about sole purpose, it's always the question, does it cover other weapons of mass destruction, or it's just for nuclear? The second part is even harder to address, the second part of the Russian military doctrine. As Tom mentioned, indeed, the conventional imbalance between Russia and NATO, or even between Russia and the United States, is staggering. If you look at the number of planes, ships, cruise missiles, you name it, the balance is not in the Russian favor. So if you consider that, it's easy to see how nuclear weapons could be seen as indispensable if, God forbid, there is a major war. It's hard to see how Russia can win an all-out major war with NATO without deterring such a war with nuclear weapons. Russia still went quite a long way in its reliance on nuclear weapons. So when it dropped the no first use pledge in 1993, its military was in disarray. Then there was 2000 military doctrine, which still had quite broad options for nuclear use. That was changed to pretty much today's language in 2010 military doctrine, and in 2014 military doctrine, strategic non-nuclear deterrence was introduced, which is intermediate stage between nuclear use and just conventional war fighting. So you see this as Russian military got better, as its position became more secure, the reliance on nuclear weapons decreased, and those conditions under which can consider use became more narrow and more refined. However, to go further than that, probably we'll need to address the security concerns and power imbalances in one way or the other. I'm not sure if it's even possible. It's hard for me to see how Russia and the United States can negotiate over overall US military strengths, because US has its power not only to deter Russia or to deal with Russia, but also deal with China and to deal with adversaries all over the world. So it's a very open question for me what exactly can be done here. However, if any of the states possessing nuclear weapons proclaim the no first use policy and especially align its actions with this statement, I think it will be the better for everybody. And United States, which is probably the most secure out of all nuclear weapon states, could be a good candidate to start with. So I frankly would love for United States to go in that direction, but obviously it's not for me to decide. And I leave it here.
Thank you very much, Andrei, also for calling our attention to this interconnection between nuclear weapons, other weapons of mass destruction, chemical and biological, and of course, conventional, because of the risk of escalation from conventional to nuclear conflict. And of course, in a sense, agreeing with Tom about the fact that Russia is still encouraged to keep its nuclear weapons because it feels insecure or in a state of inferiority regarding its conventional weapons. So that again would lead perhaps to have maybe a broader conversation, broader approach than just to focus on nuclear weapons. Now, I would like to invite General Bernard Norlin from France, former Air Defense Commander and Air Combat Commander of the French Air Force, and he's also the Vice President of Initiative for Nuclear Disarmament, IDN, one of the French nuclear disarmament movements. Bernard, of course, you as a former military and directly involved in the conduct of the French nuclear doctrine of nuclear deterrence, you can explain why France has always been reluctant to agree to a non-first use policy. Bernard? Oh, we seem to have lost Bernard. So maybe...
It's okay?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, please.
Okay, thank you, Mark. First, I would like to thank the co-sponsoring organization for having organized this campaign about the promotion of a no first use policy for the nuclear armed states. Indeed, as you know, in the current strategic context, maybe never than before, the risk of a nuclear conflict or explosions has never been so high. And it is urgent to reduce the role of nuclear weapons and to advance towards nuclear disarmament. Many thanks also to have invited me to present the position of my country, France. But if it is an honor, it is also a challenge, because France is clearly and strongly against a no first use policy. I will try in a few words to explain why France has such a tough and rigid position about the no first use policy, but also in what conditions and the circumstances this behavior could change. The roots are historical and geopolitical. General de Gaulle has created the force de frappe, the strike force, to assert France's independence and strategic autonomy. It was during the Cold War, 60 years ago, to defend France against the threat of a massive conventional attack by the Soviet Union. But after all these years, the nuclear France doctrine has not changed. French nuclear deterrence is still the cornerstone of the French defense and security policy. Moreover, it is a symbol power. The role of nuclear weapons is officially to protect the vital interests of France in a wide range of scenarios, not just to deter a nuclear attack. At the beginning, this concept was called the weak to the strong concept, and the French experts spoke of the rôle égalisateur de l'arme nucléaire, which means an equalizer or the capacity to make up for conventional weapons' inferiority on the battlefield. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I did not know that. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the concept became a strong to the weak concept. But fundamentally, it has not changed. And it still means the possibility of first use in case of threats against French vital interests, which may include a conventional, chemical, biological, or even a cyber attack. It is the reason why the strategic forces are still equipped with fighter bombers and nuclear missiles. They are called the pre-strategic component, and their role is to deliver a warning strike. But they are very similar to tactical nuclear weapons. To sum up, French nuclear weapons are part of a concept of deterrence aimed at protecting the vital interest of the country from any aggression by a state that might threaten them, regardless of where the aggression comes from or what form it takes. No first use is therefore not compatible with the French logic of deterrence. For this reason, France has repeatedly rejected even the idea of a no first use policy, not only for itself, but it also has continuously used its influence on its allies within NATO and with the US to prevent a no first use policy. Nevertheless, some situations could lead France to give up its first use policy. The first one is France's fear to be isolated in Europe as the sole nuclear weapon state. For that reason, France has always looked for a nuclear proximity with the UK and had signed with the UK the Lancaster House Treaties in 2010, with an important part given to nuclear cooperation. No doubt that the latest British statement on the increase of the UK nuclear warheads has strengthened the French nuclear status. But if a majority of European states decide to ban nuclear weapons from their soil or are in favor of a no first use policy for NATO, it will be difficult for France to continue to pledge for a first use option. A fortiori, if the new US President Joe Biden supports and adopts a no first use policy or a sole purpose policy on the occasion of the 2021 Nuclear Posture Review. And if a no first use act is voted by the American Congress, NATO and its member states will have to reconsider their position. All the more so because NATO's strategic concept of 2010 stated that the alliance was aiming to create the conditions for a world without nuclear weapons. The second reason for a possible change for France in the no first use French policy is the fact that France and its nuclear doctrine are in total contradiction with its commitment under Article 5 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The third reason is that France is not compliant with the law of armed conflicts, with the law of international humanitarian law, and with the general trend in arms control and disarmament law to reduce the impact of weapons on populations and environments. My conclusion is that a change in the French first use policy is not impossible, but it will depend only on pressure coming from its allies, the US, and other NATO members, but also from the P5 stance, with obviously the exception of the UK. Without this pressure, I don't think, under the current situation, that France on its decision accept to give up to its first use concept. For this reason, I point out the necessity for this campaign to support an American statement for a no first use policy. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Bernard. And I think it's important that you mention the concept of vital interests, which is very similar to what Tom mentioned about existential approach, or Andrei mentioned the Russian doctrine about a threat to the very existence of a state. So these are very similar concepts. Now the question is whether all these scenarios that have been mentioned of attack or aggression using non-nuclear means, such as conventional, chemical, biological, or cyber, are likely to consist or to lead to threats to vital interests. Among the expert community, there is no one that argues that such a scenario exists, that any conventional, chemical, biological, cyber attack would affect vital interests. So we are coming back to this idea that nuclear weapons are meant in principle to deter only nuclear attacks. Just a small point, you talked about Article 5 of the NPT. Of course, I'm sure you meant Article 6. Thank you, Bernard. And now we move to Lord Haney of Chiswick from the United Kingdom. Lord Haney is chair of the All-Party Group on Global Security and Non-Proliferation, and of course a long-standing expert on all these issues about arms control, nuclear threats, and he's been leading the movement or the opposition in Parliament in Britain to promote nuclear disarmament and in particular non-first use as one of the steps towards nuclear disarmament. Lord Haney, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And before I start, could I just say to Tom Countryman how grateful I was for that nice compliment he paid me. It was rather a long time ago, which is a reminder that I have not had anything to do with Britain's foreign or nuclear policy for a long time. Today's conference to discuss, and I would say hopefully to promote, commitments by nuclear weapon possessor states to no first use policies is, I would say, both timely and welcome. and I make no apologies for beginning my remarks with a geopolitical overview. Nuclear doctrines like no first use cannot hope to spread and prosper without considering the global strategic security framework in which they would be situated. Now, that global geopolitical overview in the spring of 2021 has both positive and negative features. On the positive side is the decision by the incoming Biden administration and Russia to extend the New START treaty, capping their strategic weapons for the full 5 years available under the treaty. Now, that extension provides not only an opportunity to maintain that cap further into the future, but to reduce it, recognizing that the arsenals of those two powers, by far and away the greatest arsenals in the world, are far greater than is needed to assure credible deterrence. Another potentially positive feature is the holding later this year of last year's postponed Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. And I use the word potentially advisedly because it is, of course, no sure thing that that conference outcome will in fact be positive. Its predecessor in 2015 certainly was not. The proposed summit meeting between Presidents Biden and Putin is another potential plus or a minus. At least it is being recognized that nuclear arms control will need to be on the agenda of that meeting. There is, however, no lack of negative features. The rise in tension between the US and China and between the US and its NATO allies and Russia are certainly not going to facilitate discussion of nuclear doctrines, even if they do make such a discussion more necessary, as I believe they do. The absence so far of China from all such discussions is another lacuna which really needs to be filled. And I don't often find myself agreeing with the Trump administration, but I think that on that point, they were quite right, although they got the timing and the manner of involving China completely wrong, which is why they didn't succeed. And hanging over the whole scene like a dark cloud are, of course, the nuclear programs of North Korea and Iran, which have the capacity to damage the whole non-proliferation treaty regime, perhaps irretrievably. And the modernization programs of the P5 nuclear powers often look a lot more like expansion than they do simply modernization. So there's plenty to worry about, as well as some positive features. Now, in February 2020, that's about 15 months ago, the P5 met in London at deputy minister level, itself an unusual event, and announced publicly their intention to start a dialogue on strategic stability at the time of the NPT review conference, then scheduled for May of last year. That conference, of course, was postponed, and the dialogue has not yet started. And I would suggest it is urgent that it does start now. Why? Because such a dialogue between the P5, if it were to be established on a continuing basis, provides the best way of drawing China into global nuclear discussions without asking it to accept some rules laid down by others before they even get to the table. And because it would also provide a forum in which crucial elements of nuclear doctrine, such as no first use and sole purpose, could be considered discreetly. Now, I mentioned sole purpose, and I noted quite a lot of reference to that in preceding contributions, because that aspect of nuclear doctrine was a crucial component of the negative security assurances given by the P5 and by the UN Security Council in 1995, when it was decided to extend the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty sine die. Since then, the waters have been considerably muddied in that respect, sole purpose, including, I have to say, regretfully, by the recent integrated review of security policy by my own country, the UK. As for no first use itself, I would myself have no hesitation in saying that it would strengthen global strategic security massively if all nuclear weapon possessor states were to adopt it, thus reducing the prominence of nuclear weapons in their security planning. But it is not, frankly, helped getting that commitment by all possessor states by menacing statements and deployments of non-nuclear forces, such as have recently occurred with respect to Taiwan and on Russia's border with Ukraine. No first use also requires a degree of trust between the nuclear possessor states that they would in all circumstances stand by any commitment they entered into, even when push came to shove. And that was a point that I thought Andre made very clearly when he said not a lot of people actually believed that China and India mean what they say, or Russia did when a short period when it subscribed to the doctrine, because that trust does not currently exist. So we shouldn't be too depressed if progress towards non-first use commitments is slow, nor should we abandon, I believe, that as being a worthwhile overall objective. Now, I mentioned earlier the passages on the UK's nuclear policy in our recent integrated review of security, foreign policy, and development policies. Those passages on nuclear policy, in particular, the raising of the cap on nuclear warheads and the defense put forward in that document of, quote, deliberate ambiguity, both about our nuclear arsenal and about our doctrines, have been widely criticized right across the political spectrum, and not just by the opposition parties, and not just by those who, for many decades now, have campaigned for unilateral nuclear disarmament by the UK. When the House of Lords, which I'm a member, held a 5-hour debate last week on the review, only 1 out of more than 50 speakers defended the government's stance. I personally posed the question whether, if all nuclear possessor states practiced policies of, quote, deliberate ambiguity, unquote, the world would be a safer place and the risk of nuclear war would be reduced. And I answered in the negative. Well, that debate will continue. The pity is that the review that we've held and published will inhibit the positive role which many of us had hoped the UK would take at the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference this August, as they've so often done in the past. There is plenty of lost ground here to be made up. In finishing my remarks, I would just plead for avoiding clear-cut and apocalyptic conclusions as the discussion of all these issues continues. It'll be slow, it will be difficult, and it will be strewn with obstacles, not all of which will have an awful lot of objective credibility to them. But there are, I believe, opportunities now to set off on a new footing and to reverse the recent erosion of nuclear arms control, and we need to make the most of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lord Heine, for having articulated so brilliantly all the key questions. Of course, you mentioned the role of China and the importance of engagement and negotiations on arms control and non-proliferation with China. I would just like to recall, of course, that there are some frameworks available. Of course, there's the group of P5. Within the NPT, there is the Conference on Disarmament, which has actually nuclear disarmament on its agenda for many years and not very successfully, as we know. Of course, you raised the important aspect of the negative security assurances, which is directly connected to non-first use, because as has been said several times, including at the Conference on Disarmament, the best negative security assurance, the best assurance that nuclear weapons would not be used against non-nuclear weapon states would be a non-first use policy. Because by definition, if those are non-nuclear weapon states, they would be benefiting from a non-first use policy. Of course, you mentioned the importance of trust among the actors, and of course, this shows the importance of not being content with unilateral declarations, but building also on actual agreements, legally binding agreements, and enforced structures. And you mentioned, of course, the case of the UK's decision to increase its arsenal, and this is part of the messaging, the signaling that, of course, may be intended to strengthen the position of the UK, but that may also be counterproductive because it will weaken the UK's position regarding those nuclear weapon states that are already increasing their own arsenals. And also there's the aspect of transparency that has been reduced in the case of UK, so it will be harder for the UK to argue towards countries like Iran or North Korea to increase their own transparency. So thank you very much for having raised this important point. And now we turn to Commander Robert Fawcett from the UK also. He's a former nuclear submarine commanding officer of the Royal Navy. So like Bernard Merlin, as a military, he had been involved in implementing the UK nuclear doctrine. And so it will be interesting to hear from him about his approach to non-first use. Commander?
Thank you, Mark, and good day to everyone, or good afternoon to everyone participating in this webinar. As you will have gathered, I am a former Royal Navy nuclear submarine commanding officer who in the 1970s served in a Polaris missile submarine with responsibility for the permission to fire key, which would have launched 48 300 kiloton warheads. I did so on the understanding that we would only be ordered to do so as a counterattack, to retaliate against an incoming nuclear weapon attack by the Soviets at that time. I would have withheld permission if I had had any reason to think we were being ordered to launch a first strike. I was not prepared under any circumstances to start a nuclear war based on an intelligence assessment that the Soviets might be on the point of launching a nuclear attack. Intelligence can be fatally flawed, or wide open to misinterpretation, or just be straightforward prejudice manipulation, as the 2003 US-UK invasion of Iraq showed all too clearly. Fortunately, our UK Secretary of State for Defence at the time, his pre-war assertion that nuclear weapons might be used to counter Saddam Hussein launching a chemical or biological weapon attack did not need to be acted upon. In the run-up to the 2016 UK Trident submarine replacement debate in the UK Parliament, I questioned the cost and utility of Trident missiles in this post-Cold War world. I was concerned that we were ignoring the UK's commitment to Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The NPT entered into force in 1970, 2 years before I went on my first Polaris patrol. And it encouraged me to think that the doctrine of mutually assured destruction was indeed so mad that within my lifetime, nuclear weapons would become the dinosaurs they deserved to be. I was wrong. So it was quite a shock for me to discover that first use had secretly always been part of UK planning, but had not been openly declared as such. We at sea were under the false impression that Polaris was solely a counter-strike weapon. And still today, hiding in plain sight, but camouflaged behind the comfort blanket phrase, weapons of last resort, is the fact that the UK's policy of strategic ambiguity, as it is now called, still includes first strike as a last resort, i.e. if our conventional forces are in danger of being overrun and we have nothing else to recourse to. But from a personal point of view, this ambiguity places today's UK Triton submarine commanding officers in an impossible position. If nothing is ruled out, then everything, including first use, can be ruled in. However, submerged on patrol, they have no way of knowing why they're being ordered to fire, what the target is, or the consequences on civil populations of doing so. They therefore cannot make the legal and moral judgments that the Nuremberg principles require them to do. They will not know if they are carrying out a superior's order to commit a war crime. Instead, they must completely trust in our Prime Minister, who, uniquely among nuclear weapon states, has the sole authority for a decision to fire with no military or third-party approval required. Interestingly, another former Royal Navy submarine captain recently stated, "I would not press the button for Boris." Why? Because he did not trust Prime Minister Boris Johnson. And events in the UK today do make one question his moral judgment. Similar reservations were expressed by senior US military during President Trump's time in office. So I fully support examining whether now is the right time to press for a global no first use policy. Much as I applaud and support the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which entered into force recently, the reality is that it's not likely to be observed by the nuclear weapons states. But it well may apply such pressure on them that they feel the need to concede some relaxation of threat posture, such as no first use, if only to show some compliance with NPT Article 6. But a big obstacle to overcome is that the nuclear weapon states justify possession of their weapons and the lawfulness of first use by referring to the International Court of Justice 1996 advisory opinion, which by a casting vote could not conclude whether or not the threat or use of nuclear weapons would be lawful if the very existence of a state was threatened, although it did decide that their use would generally be unlawful. Similarly, the 1977 conference chaired by the International Committee of the Red Cross that negotiated Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions acceded to the nuclear weapon states' insistence that the protocol should not name and shame any specific weapons. This enabled the UK and the US to include in military law handbooks that the use of nuclear weapons was not prohibited by the protocol. A factually correct conclusion, but speciously achieved. I therefore wonder if the UN General Assembly could be prevailed upon to frame a more specific request for the ICJ and also possibly for the ICRC to give an advisory opinion on whether there are any circumstances in which first use or even the threat of first use of nuclear weapons would be lawful. The danger, of course, is that if first use is deemed unlawful, it may seem to justify their use or threat of it for a counterstrike, but this may be a temporary price worth paying. In parallel, let us also consistently remind those states not signed up to the NPT that the nuclear comfort blankets they think they shelter under provide no comfort at all. By funding a nuclear armory that is already more than big enough to end the world, they are actually further away from being equipped to defend themselves against far more immediate and realistic threats. And lastly, we must applaud the actions of the US Democrat Party, which has introduced two very important bills into Congress. One to cancel the Sea-Launched Nuclear Cruise Missile Program, and of great relevance to this webinar, one, to adopt a policy of no first use or sole purpose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commander, and thank you in particular for raising one important aspect of our conversation, which is the potential humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapons, as recognized, by the way, by all NPT states parties in the 2010 review conference final document, and that this awareness actually conjugated with the awareness of the risk, the rising risk of use, led, as you said, to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And the second aspect, of course, that you raised, very, very important, the 1996 advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, which perhaps would be worth revisiting or updating now that we have precisely the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and there's awareness of the higher risk of use of nuclear weapons. Thank you very much. We move to a representative of a non-nuclear weapon state, but which has been not only enjoying extended deterrence within NATO, but also hosting American tactical nuclear weapons. Ms. Uta Zapf. She's a former chair of the Bundestag Subcommittee on Disarmament and Arms Control, and alumni member and former co-president of Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. Of course, Uta, you've been activist also campaigning for nuclear disarmament. What do you think that German people think about how safe they are under this nuclear umbrella, including with hosting nuclear weapons, which could make them a target in case of nuclear conflict? Uta, please unmute yourself.
Sorry, yes, I forgot. Thank you very much for inviting me to this very important and interesting conference. And I think it is very important to press for a no first use policy to be implemented, to say this first. Mark, I will refer to the reactions in Germany during my presentation. But the first thing I wanted to say is that the beginning of this year was very, very positive in my eyes, because Joe Biden was inaugurated president of the United States. The Treaty of Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons went into effect. The New START Treaty was prolonged. The negotiations on preserving the Iran deal started in Vienna, and Democrats issued a No First Use Act. So this gives me some hope for the future. And I think it will be very, very crucial how the international community is going to react to these policies and how they will support the no first use implications, because we have to do something against the rising risk of nuclear war. I think this was clear by everything that has been said before me. So we have to embrace the opportunity right now, and the reduction of the role of nuclear weapons in our defense strategy was also an issue in 2010 when the new NATO strategy was implemented, and they wanted to reduce the role of nuclear weapons, but it didn't really happen. And there was very crucial how the German government acted by that time, because in 2010, we had a coalition of CDU, CSU, and the liberals, and in their coalition accord, they wanted to have removed the nuclear weapons from German soil, or better, of course, from European soil. During that time, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany really, the parliaments voted on that. Our parliament voted unanimously, with no rejecting a vote, that we want to get rid of these nuclear weapons, that we don't want the modernization of the B-61 gravity bombs, and that we don't want to have a new, how to say, a new platform for that, like the Tornado is going to be out of use in 2025. So I hope that the German government, and I hope also that the parliaments will support a policy like that, but I'm not sure whether the whole parliaments of NATO countries will join and rejoice in this development, because I think Poland would like to have their own nuclear weapons or US nuclear weapons stationed in Poland. So we have to be aware there will be, as in 2016 when Obama tried to implement no-use policy, there will be discussions by NATO partners who want to have the nuclear deterrence provided to them, and they want to have the nuclear umbrella. What I think is very, very good to hint at, and I would have done it in my presentation too, but I just mention it, that people in Germany, 80% of them, if you look at the polls, agree that nuclear weapons should be removed from the world, that they want a world without nuclear weapons, but still within NATO, they couldn't agree on removing the nuclear weapons from German or from European soil, and they couldn't agree on reducing the role of nuclear weapons. So that is one big thing that should be that should happen. So if implemented, this would be a very good first step, but you have other obligations to fulfill. One is to cut the budgets for modernization of nuclear weapons, and there's ongoing discussions in the United States now, where, for instance, Admiral Charles Richard wants, because of the risk of Russia and China, they want to have the whole triad modernized. I think that this would be a very bad step in a wrong direction. And so if implemented, you have to reduce the modernization too. And then it already was mentioned that what happens at the nuclear, the review conference of the NPT will be very crucial for the future development. There are still huge steps to do, which were proposed in 2010, the famous 13 steps, and a lot of them are not implemented. For instance, CTBT, FMCT, and the ABM treaty should be stabilized, which was suggested in the 13 steps, but the ABM treaty has been removed by George W. Bush. And so I think it would be very, very important to suggest to take up negotiations on missile defenses and their limitation, because missile defenses right now are driving arms races. And I know nobody suggested it until now, but I really think it would be very important. Also de-alerting more of the nuclear weapons that are still in the world, and to really develop verification capabilities in case that we have a denuclearization. Really, we need verification capabilities, and I think the British government, when Labour was there, it was Miliband, a prime minister, they vowed to develop verification instruments together with Norway. This should go on. I think that's very important. But adopting a no first use policy will only be the first step and a door opener for an urgently needed dialogue on the role of nuclear weapons in military doctrines and strategies, which was mentioned with a strategic dialogue of the P5. Mentioning all that, I really appreciate that Lord Hannay mentioned that Great Britain just announced a new strategic concept, so to say, by bringing more nuclear weapons to the ceiling of 260 instead of 180 cap. And I think that will be a really bad sign for the negotiations of the review conference, because how can non-nuclear weapon states really trust in nuclear weapon states who just have their numbers augmented by 40%. So I think if you could find a way to renounce this strategy would be very good. In addition, just to my time is up, I know. In addition, we have to have a negotiation on conventional weapons. We have to reinstall, for instance, the NATO-Russia Council as a real instrument of dialogue between the two blocs, so to say. We have to try to save the Open Skies Treaty. And maybe if we are very happy, we could come back to the situation in 2008 when in the context of the OSCE, there was a discussion about a security architecture for Russia, for Europe with the Russians, which would be a very good sign to take the tensions that have arisen in the last few weeks, years since 2014, and to have risk reductions there. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Uta, for reminding, of course, the importance of the relationship between non-first use and extended deterrence, and that's one of the major obstacles and reasons why most NATO states are reluctant to move in that direction. And that requires, as you said, direct negotiations with Russia, reestablishment of all these instruments that have been built upon the, since the Cold War, like the CSBMs in the OSCE and CFE treaty, precisely to restore some trust and some confidence, because reliance on nuclear weapons, unfortunately, for many states, depends very much on their threat perception. Thank you also for mentioning the problems of modernization, which of course are not directly related to the non-first use or first use policy, but that of course also send a bad signal. If you look at the Article 6 of the NPT, which talked about cessation of nuclear arms race at an early date, that was in 1968. And now we see countries having programs over the next 30 years or beyond. France announced that its nuclear submarines would still sail in 2090, which would be almost 1 century after the treaty and the NPT entered into force for France. So thank you so much for this. And last but not least, we go to Yasmin Silva, who's the partnership manager of Beyond the Bomb organization. Yasmin, you've been involved in many campaigns for nuclear disarmament or, of course, non-first use, and we're happy to hear from you. Yasmin?
Thank you all. And this is certainly a tough act to follow of some really great minds and actors on this issue. So I think we've covered, at least for this region that this section of the conference is covering, I think we've covered a unique range of different, both nuclear armed states and NATO states. And so I want to bring a unique perspective, and that is that of specifically a campaigner in the United States. And so I think that in order, like I said, we've heard from all these speakers, and that it will take action from many places across the world to move the needle on no first use. And I want to talk about what we're doing specifically in the United States to change that reality and open that door. Specifically as citizens, we're the ones who would be impacted by nuclear war and nuclear weapons, and our voices deserve to be heard. At Beyond the Bomb, the use of nuclear weapons ever is unconscionable, but as it's been laid out by other speakers, we see just how far we are from eliminating these weapons. And we need to take steps to mitigate the risk of nuclear weapons use that make us safer now, while doing the work to make ourselves permanently safe from those weapons. And I think that that's where no first use comes in. So the United States, culturally, historically, wants to have all options on the table. And this runs counter to what a no first use policy does. Yet this ethos of reserving all of our options, as we've heard, is detrimental to our actual security. And it holds us back and actually takes options off the table for diplomatic negotiations, or in some cases, as we've heard, might take diplomacy off the table completely. As organizers, and specifically in the United States, we see it as our job to educate and encourage a cultural shift here, a reframing of what it means to have options and what options actually serve us. And that's not only to our elected officials who at the end of the day have the say over what happens, but to the everyday people to whom those elected officials answer. And also for whom nuclear war and weapons tends to be a far removed concept, other than the occasional fear-mongering that pops up on the ever-rapid news cycle. Organizers and activists can serve as a mouthpiece for the wonderful scholarship and expertise that the speakers that came before me laid out, again, both to the general public as well as elected officials. And this method is working. In 2018, polling showed that under our current nuclear posture review, it's not popular with the US public as the majority support a no first use policy. More recent polling from 2020 shows that the American public doesn't want us to spend more money on nuclear weapons, are not in favor of a modernized ICBM program, also known as the Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent, or GBSD, especially when they realize that it makes us less safe. They are extremely concerned. As it was said in both this session and previous session, which if you haven't had a chance to watch it, I really suggest you do. First use increases the likelihood of nuclear detonation by accident or misunderstanding. This is unacceptable, and the general public on the whole recognizes this. Anecdotally, from conversations that I've had in the United States, when we have conversations with everyday people, they assume that no first use is already the policy here. That's how common sense this measure is. So what's the solution from our standpoint? Policy and activism go hand in hand. 2 weeks ago, no first use legislation was reintroduced in the United States by Representative Adam Smith in the House and Senator Elizabeth Warren in the Senate. And we're prepared to leverage this moment. Groups across the United States have been passing local and state resolutions in support of no first use and other important policies that create a credible no first use policy, some of which have been spoken about by other speakers, such as de-alerting, taking things off hair trigger alert, sole authority over the nuclear arsenal. National groups like Beyond the Bomb and others are undertaking a grassroots campaign to educate the public as well as lawmakers about the necessity of no first use to make our country and the world a safer place. As long as we have first use, we will create weapons that can be used first. We saw low-yield nukes under the Trump administration. We are now talking about deploying weapons on different submarines than they currently are through the sea-launched cruise missile. And this is driven not only by war hawks in the United States, but it's funded by the military-industrial complex and their lobbyists. But while we can't match those powers dollar for dollar, we can certainly come to bear through people power. At a time when the world is reeling from a pandemic, we've seen firsthand what happens when we rely on military solutions and don't invest in alternatives or prepare for threats that don't have a military answer. If there is a time for a shift in posture to signal where our priorities actually lie, now is the time. We have the public support. We have a president who has signaled support of this policy. And in the United States, we have legislators that are willing to step up and introduce legislation to change this reality. The pieces are there. We just need to seize the moment. So while it is my opinion that the US has a lot of work to do and carries the burden of stepping up to the plate to create conditions for a nuclear-free world, as its hand in the creation of nuclear weapons and being the only country to have used them offensively. Despite this, we can't do this alone. Time and time again, we are told in the United States that our first use policy is welcomed by our allies. We are told that other countries that have no first use policies, that those policies aren't credible. We need a concerted effort to change this narrative, both across nuclear armed states and those that fall under nuclear umbrellas, if we hope to shift away from perceived nuclear and military security and towards real human security. If you're in the United States, I invite you to partner with Beyond the Bomb organizationally or get involved in an individual capacity. But for those of you who are looking at a broader global picture, I'm really excited to announce a new way that we can come together to tackle this truly international problem. Today, a number of groups from around the world, including some involved here, are launching a global no first use campaign to support each other's efforts with 3 key objectives in mind. The first is to advocate for the adoption and implementation of no first use policies by nuclear armed states. Second is to assist the US no first use campaign by building necessary support from US allies in the Asia Pacific and NATO Europe regions. And third is to advance no first use as part of broader objectives of nuclear risk reduction, non-proliferation and disarmament, and as complementary to other related measures and initiatives. As has been laid out today, no first use is an important policy milestone, but I'd like to reiterate some of those points and why this global campaign is so important to a broader non-proliferation and disarmament framework. So policy options for the possible no first use of nuclear weapons, which are maintained by most nuclear armed states, as said, increase the risk of nuclear weapons could be used in a conflict. They also prevent nuclear armed states from participating in good faith processes for nuclear abolition because the first use option means that they believe they need to retain nuclear weapons for a range of security scenarios. not just to deter a nuclear attack. Additionally, the adoption of no first use can provide the impetus to open additional doors, be them political, military, and operational, for measures to implement the policy and to further reduce the role of nuclear weapons in security doctrines and to advance nuclear disarmament. And most importantly, as I've seen firsthand, no first use is easy to understand by legislators and the wider public, and to build widespread support, including from those who don't know much about nuclear weapons and don't have the time or inclination to become nuclear policy experts. However, with this campaign, we recognize that while we may come together around the same objective of no first use, campaigns may look different from region to region around the world. It is a cornerstone of this global no first use campaign to be sensitive to geopolitical considerations with regard to the promotion and adoption of no first use policies, especially where there are related regional nuclear disarmament processes and where a nuanced approach is necessary. You know your community best, just as I can only speak to things happening in the United States and can help shape strategy here. You are best suited to understanding the context in which you operate and which strategies will thrive there to help us all succeed in achieving a no first use policy. We know that no first use is not the endpoint or the only way to move forwards towards the nuclear free world that we want to see. And we will endeavor to make connections with other issues and policy points to achieve that world. But we're stronger when we work together, and that's why we are so excited to begin this campaign. I'd like to mention some of the co-sponsoring organizations that are currently involved in the initiative. So from the UK and more internationally, we have the Abolition 2000 Working Group on Nuclear Risk Reduction. We have the Basel Peace Office in Switzerland, also working internationally. We have ourselves, Beyond the Bomb, from the United States. In Japan, we have Peace Depot. In Australia, we have People for Nuclear Disarmament. In the Czech Republic, we have Prague Vision, Institute for Sustainable Security. In Germany, and also working internationally, we have the World Future Council. And last but certainly not least, in Mexico, we have Zona Libre. And we hope that you will join this growing list. So I invite you to join as a participating organization. As I said, we are stronger and can achieve more when we're doing so in a focused and aligned way. And the more voices that we have raised from different areas of the world, the harder it will be to ignore the overwhelming demand for change to the nuclear status quo. Our first campaign meeting for this global no first use initiative will be meeting on the 27th of May. And if you're signed up for this webinar or the first webinar, we will send out information soon. And if you're watching this recording at a later date and did not register, you can email info@pnnd.org to stay in touch and join the campaign. I hope you'll join us at this critical time in order to see the change we need to enact it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yasmin, for this very important reminder of the role of civil society in promoting arms control and disarmament. As we know, all the progress made in recent decades was the result of initiatives from civil society organizations, whether we talk about the Anti-Personnel Landmine Treaty, the Cluster Munitions Convention, the Arms Trade Treaty, and of course the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. These were all initiatives coming from civil society, working with governments, finding supports, champion states to promote these causes because of their potential positive humanitarian impact. So thank you for this. And now we turn to the Q&A session. We have, I would say, a little bit more than 15 minutes left, and we have a lot of questions. So don't be frustrated if we can't answer all your questions, but you know how to reach out to us if you wish to continue this conversation after the webinar.